just to catch us up a little bit, we've been going through the whole book of Matthew, but the last, probably month and a half, something like that, we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount. And this is the last actual portion of the Sermon on the Mount. But this portion that we're reading, and we'll read it in a minute, it's the last verses of chapter 7, but our passage today, it starts with the word therefore, and we're going to read that in a minute. But when it says therefore, that means that Jesus was making a point based on what he was talking about last week. And so last week, just to get our minds there before we read it, last week we were talking about where Jesus made the point. He talked about the narrow gate and the wide gate. He talked about the narrow gate that leads to life and a wide gate that leads to destruction. And what he was talking about really is he was talking about this narrow gate of following him, of believing in him, of like living our lives for him. And he says that narrow gate path is actually harder. Like he willingly said that. He said that the wide path, he says a lot of people take the wide path, but he says that wide path leads to destruction. He says his way, his path, even though it's harder, it leads to life. That's a really important distinction there. And we see that, and it's like kind of a scary warning of Jesus saying that there's these two different ways you can go, and this is where one goes, and this is where the other one goes. But what we need to understand is that Jesus was talking about this in love, because he told you what's going to happen. He told us what's going to happen. He's like, I love you. I don't want you to end up at that place of destruction. He's like, my path is harder. It's where I'm at, but it leads to life. And he's like, will you be willing to follow me down that path? So when we get to the therefore this morning, that's where it's coming from. He's talking about, and you can see kind of the theme through the songs that we were playing too, even the firm foundation and when the storms come and the rains blow. That's in the passage that we're reading today. So they line up. But it's all of those things where Jesus is like, he's telling us that we're going to come and see him one day. Whether you believe in him or not, we are. And he's like, I don't want you to get to that day. And he said there's a people group that we talked about last week that they're going to get there. They're going to think that they're fine. And Jesus is going to say, I didn't know you. I never knew you. And he's going to say, depart from me. I never knew you. That is a really scary moment to come to see God face to face. And he says, I didn't know you. And it's time for you to leave. What he is telling us last week in love is that that's a possibility. Don't let that happen. That's a loving Savior that was telling us those things. So in light of all of those things, in light of I pray our desire to be welcomed into his kingdom, he's going to keep teaching us that same lesson. And we're going to read verses 24 through 29 of Matthew 7 this morning. I love this passage. Let's read it starting in verse 24 of Matthew 7. It says, therefore, in light of all of those things we just talked about, therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. And so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. So again, we look at this, we see how Jesus is starting this, we see the points that he's making. We see that this passage, this is the end, this is the last statements of the Sermon on the Mount. So we see this in light of what we talked about last week, but we also see this in light of the whole Sermon on the Mount, which is chapters 4, 5, 6, 7 of Matthew. And we see that this is coming in light of all of those things. He's talking to these people that are sitting on this mountainside. That's why it's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's also applicable to us today. But he's talking to these people, and he's making a really good analogy that kind of sums up all of his points. And what he does is he says that, and we just read that, he says that if someone hears this, someone has been listening to this whole sermon, even just listening to his points last week, but he's like, if somebody listens to my whole sermon, listens to everything that I'm saying, this is Jesus talking, and he listens to what I said, said, and he does them, he actually acts on what Jesus has been teaching, he says that person is a wise man. That person is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. And the meaning of the wording there, when it talks about building a house on the rock, it doesn't, I think even as, like, we read these, and even as kids and in Sunday school sometimes, it's like, there's this picture like a house just on like a giant boulder. And that could mean that. It doesn't exclude that, but it really just means like a house that's built on a foundation of stone, like stones. Now we build on a foundation of concrete. But it's talking about a home being built on a solid foundation. So Jesus talks about this wise man. He's like, if you hear everything that I'm saying and you do it, you act on it, then you're like a man who's wise and builds his house on this rock or this solid foundation. But then Jesus goes on and he talks about a different person in this passage. He talks about this person that hears what Jesus is saying, hears it all, hears all of the same message, hears all of the same words, hears all of the same truths. They hear what Jesus is saying and they choose not to do what he's saying. He just listens to him. I'm not going to do that. He says that person's like a foolish man that builds their house on the sand. And we can think about this analogy like really practically, because obviously it's still very practical to us today. And we can think about the foundation of a home or building. As we sit here today, we are sitting on the foundation of a home. And actually this room was like an added foundation later on because this used to be a garage. But it's a foundation. It's a solid structure that a home is built on. And so we can see this analogy that Jesus is making, and then we can ask, what is the purpose of a foundation? Like, why is Jesus using this analogy to make his final point in this sermon? We can even ask, what exactly is a foundation in the first place? I kind of described it a little bit, but I'm always like, I have a word. I'm always on the computer, like for work and for everything. So I just go Google, define foundation. What is a foundation? So the first dictionary definition of foundation that comes to the table is that it's the lowest load-bearing part of a building. It's typically below ground level. So for us, if you've ever seen a home being built, or maybe you've been involved in the process of a home being built or a building being built, usually it's just a patch of dirt, patch of land. They grade it and get it flattened out. Then they dig trenches for the footings, and then they start laying rebar and all of those things. They put forms around where the foundation is going to be, and then they pour concrete throughout that whole thing to create a solid, level foundation to start building on top of. And obviously, building methods have changed a little bit between 2,000 years ago and today. But it's interesting that his analogy still holds up perfectly to where we're at right now in our current practices. And so, we think about this, we think of, that's what a foundation is, but why is it so critical to go through that building process? Why is it so critical? Because it plays into exactly the point that Jesus is making when we read this. So again, go to Google. I was like, what's the importance of having a solid foundation? Why should we have it? That's what I typed in. And I think it was really interesting because it came up with a masonry website and a construction website, and they use almost the same words that Jesus uses. I was like, this is fascinating. These random websites popped up. The masonry website, when I asked it, the importance of a solid foundation in a building, it says the primary purpose of a foundation is to hold your house up. It says without it, your house would quickly sink into the ground unevenly, resulting in cracks and damage to your home. A properly built foundation will keep the home even and supported even during a flood or earthquake. Again, another just general construction website, it says the primary purpose of the foundation is to support the load of the entire building. A well-designed or strong foundation keeps the building standing while the forces of nature wreak havoc. Well-built foundations keep the occupants of the building safe during calamities such as earthquake, floods, strong winds, etc. And it's these are just, current construction websites, and they describe the purpose of a foundation, and they're describing what Jesus was describing and why we need to be built on a strong foundation. To me, it's just funny that 2,000 years later, the analogy still works perfectly. It wasn't like just some like specifically time relevant analogy. It's like this has been true since then. So like I said, when I read those I read those descriptions even that are from these, worldly places and just companies now, I see that they talk about this properly built foundation. They talk about this properly built foundation that keeps a home supported. It talks about that even during a flood or an earthquake or strong winds or as nature wreaks havoc, as it says. The second site said that a well-built foundation will keep the occupants safe during calamities. And Jesus, in verses 24 and 25 in our passage, he says, "Whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall because it was founded on the rock." Or that solid foundation that we're talking about. Jesus said, he says the rain is coming. He says the floods are coming. He says the winds will blow. Like there will be things that are going to beat on this house. Or we can rightly take it as our life. And he says that a properly or well-built foundation is what is going to cause that house to stand in the midst of those things. But then we have to ask this. When we read this, we were reading through what Jesus is saying, and he's talking about this house built on the rock. We have to ask the question, what is the rock in this analogy? When Jesus says that the wise man builds his house on the rock, we have to ask the question, what is the rock? Like, what is this rock? I think this is something that's sometimes misunderstood. I think if you ask this question in Sunday school or something like, Jesus, like that's the end of the, and that's not a bad answer for this. I think, sometimes you get to the little older groups and they ask this question, like, what's the rock? They'll be like, the Bible's the rock. And again, it's not a bad answer. Like, I think those are both good answers, but I think those answers aren't specific enough. They're not specific enough for what Jesus is saying. They're not bad, obviously, but they're not specific enough. So when we ask, what is the rock in this analogy? What Jesus actually says here, he says that whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken this person to a man who built his house on the rock. Simply acknowledging who Jesus, or that Jesus is there, it's like simply acknowledging Jesus, like maybe even identifying somewhat with him, simply hearing the words of the Bible or just understanding that the Bible exists, like simply having those things, again, that's not enough. Because what Jesus is talking about is obedience. Like when we talk about what the rock is in this passage, the rock is obedience to the words and the teachings of what Jesus is saying. It's like it's not enough just to know my name. It's not enough just to hear the words. That's good. He says the step that puts somebody on the rock is hearing what I say and actually doing it. That's where the rock comes into play. The rock is an active obedience to Jesus' words. So again, I know we probably throughout time we've talked about Jesus being the rock, and it's true, it's good. I think even those songs reference specifically Jesus as being the rock. And again, I don't think that's a bad thing. But for us to really understand what he's saying, we need to understand that it's listening and doing. And he has talked about that numerous times throughout the Sermon on the Mount. Last week was a really loving warning, but last week Jesus talked about these people. He says there's going to be people that come to see me at the end of their life, and they're going to say, Lord, Lord, like I knew your name. I did things in your name. Like I said all of these things in your name. And he's like, even when they say that, Jesus is like, I didn't know you. Like you say you did all these things. You say this and you say that, but I didn't know you. Jesus talked about that. Jesus was warning us about that last week. And he's kind of still warning this week because he's talking about if you don't listen and do what I'm doing, what I say, then you're still going to be this guy that's building his house on sand. Like without the obedience part, it's still life on sand. It's a house that's not going to stand. It's the storms are going to come and that house is going to get destroyed. It's coming to that last day and hearing, go away from me. Like, I didn't know you. It's still part of that warning that's happening here. And again, I believe it's firmly out of love. Throughout all of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus he's been calling things out. He's been calling people hypocrites a lot. Like, there's so many passages in the Sermon on the Mount where he's like, don't be like the hypocrites. And we talked about it over and over again. When we talk about that word hypocrite, it's talking about, the original word talks about somebody that's acting. It's an actor. There's a lot of people that act out these things that, we can show up to church, or, we can tell people that we're a Christian, or maybe like we can wear like Christian t-shirt or something, like wear a Jesus is my homeboy shirt. Like, we can wear those things that, like, we can act the part. But Jesus isn't interested in us acting the part. He wants it to be for real. He wants us to be on the rock. Like I said, it's not just knowing, it's not just hearing, it's actually the doing part that grounds our lives on the rock. We don't want to be, as Jesus talked about over and over again, these hypocrites, because it's still the warning continues. These hypocrites that Jesus talked about over and over again are building lives on foundations of sand. And foundations of sand will not support what's coming. It's really important. In both of these scenarios, that Jesus brings to the table in these verses, he talks about the wise man in verses 24 and 25. He talks about the foolish man in verses 26 and 27. In both of these scenarios, in both of them, the rains descended, the floods came, the winds blew, and these houses were caught in the storm. Both of them. Jesus doesn't say, perhaps the rain will come. Perhaps the flood will come. Perhaps the wind will blow. He doesn't say that, perhaps it'll happen for the wise guy. Perhaps it will happen for the foolish man. He doesn't say any of those things. He says, it's coming. He says it's coming for both of these people. In both scenarios, when we read this, the weather happened. The storm came. Things got difficult in both of these scenarios. And there's a really important lesson for us in that truth. Because as we sit here today, as we're living through this life that Jesus is instructing us on, as we go through these things, as we understand what he's saying, then we come to this understanding that for all of us, there's a storm coming if it's not here right now. For each and every one of us, there will be a storm here eventually. Like, there's a God-given truth that it's like, be ready for the storm. Jesus is talking to both of these people. He's like, you're choosing very different paths in life. But no, for both of you, the storm is coming. It's coming for all of us if it's not here already. So the question for us today as we read this, a question that we need to consider is, what foundation will we be built on when the storm gets here? Will we be built on an obedience to Jesus Christ? Or will we be built on the countless grains of sand that is everything else in this world? It's a question we need to consider. Will we be built solely on obedience to Jesus Christ, or will we be built on the countless grains of sand that will get all of your attention in this world because there's so much of it? There's only one place where that firm foundation lies. So like I said, for each of us, the storm's coming, the clouds are on the horizon if they're not here already. We need to be prepared to weather the storm. And there's only one way to get prepared for that. There's only one place where that protection lies. And it makes me think of a passage. I want to go together if you can, or I'll read it, but we're going to go to James chapter 1. Like, this whole thought process makes me think of James chapter 1. So let's go to James 1 together. It's closer to the end of the Bible than the Gospels, after Hebrews. James 1, and we're going to be reading verses 2 through 4. So James 1, verses 2 through 4. And it says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." James starts in verse 2 and he says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials." We're going to talk about that, what that means. But I love this passage. Again, this is one that's always stuck with me. And our daughter's middle name actually comes from this passage. I was teaching on this passage years and years ago, and the word joy there, and it's an interesting word in the Greek. The Greek language word for the word joy there is the word kara. And I was like, that's a really, I was teaching it, learning about what that word meant and everything. Just loved it, and happened to be like right around the time where we found out that Eileen was pregnant with our daughter. I was like, I love this word. Let's make it her middle name. Some days she likes it, some days she doesn't. Because Eileen will call her by that name, and she's like, but I love it because of what it means. And here it is translated as this word joy. But the original word in the way that it was written, it means deeper than like what we would talk about joy as. I think typically when we talk about joy in exactly the same words as we talk about like happiness. We would talk about them as the same thing. But the word kara, which is translated as joy here in James 1, it really is this word that has a deeper meaning. It means joy because of the grace of God. It's like there's joy, but this word, it means joy because of the grace of God. It's like I wanted my daughter to carry that with her through life, that there's this joy because of the grace of God. We see James, and he talks about this. He talks about incredible joy. Like he says, count it all joy. He's talking about this incredible joy because of the grace of God. But then we have to notice the circumstances that he talks about it in. He says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. This statement includes the very same truth that Jesus is teaching us in Matthew 7. James says, he doesn't say, get ready to count it all joy if you ever run into a trial. No, he says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, not even just singular trial. He says, count it all joy when you fall into the various trials that will be coming. Like that's the point that he's making. It's the same point that Jesus is making, that the trial is coming, that the storm is coming. But James says, count it all joy when you get there. And I think for us, when we have this mindset oftentimes where the word joy means the same thing as happiness, we're like, James, like what in the world are you talking about? Like that doesn't really sound realistic. Like, do you live in the real world, James? You're telling me to be happy when the hard times get here? Is that all you're telling me? But that's not all that he's saying. When we read this, we have to understand exactly what he's saying. I said James isn't talking about just be happy when the trial gets here. That's not what he's talking about. He's not just put your smile on your face in the difficult times. Again, that's not what he's talking about. James is talking about something in this passage, something that can overwhelm our entire perspective on a situation. He's talking about something that can overcome the mindset that we're stuck in. He's talking about this thing that even in the worst of trials, even when the worst storm is raging, that there can still yet be joy. And why that can be is that because for a true believer, for one that really believes in Jesus Christ and everything that he's done for us, for one that's a real follower of Jesus Christ, for one as we think of the whole Sermon on the Mount that isn't acting, but is actually a follower of Jesus Christ, for one who is actively obedient to what Jesus says, for one that knows and believes without any doubt that Jesus Christ died, he was buried, and he rose again for my sin, for our sin, for one that believes that completely. For that person, there is a storm shelter, really, of joy. For somebody that is a true believer in Jesus Christ, while the storm is raging, there is a storm shelter of joy. That storm shelter of joy is a place that is rooted deeply within an understanding of the grace of God. This storm shelter of grace-rooted joy is a place in the storm where we can trust Him, we can follow Him, we can even obey Him practically. It's a place that will allow this house, my life, to stand even through the worst of it. Through the worst of life's storms. And James tells us that weathering through these storms with Jesus will refine us. It will build up our endurance. Because we'll need it. Because like James says, various trials are coming, not just one. But each one that we weather with Jesus will build up our endurance and our faith for when the next one gets here. It's a strengthening process for us. Again, it makes me even think of another passage, which I'll just read to you. You can turn there. It's on our way back to, in Romans 5, it's on our way back to Matthew. We'll be back in Matthew 7 in a second, but we're going to stop on the way there in Romans 5 because it strengthens this point even further. I'm going to be reading the first 5 verses of Romans 5, and then we'll be back into Matthew 7. But Romans 5 and the first 5 verses of it, it says, "Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have access by faith into His grace in which we stand, and rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. And not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. And now know that hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who is given to us." When we tie this now into this passage in Romans 5, we can see that we were saved by that faith, the belief in what Jesus has done that we just talked about. It says in this passage, we're now at peace with an almighty God. It says that we stand in His grace and rejoice in His glory. And then Paul, as he's writing to the Romans, in a similar statement, he says that we can glory in tribulations. And that these tribulations or these trials or these storms, they produce within us perseverance or endurance and character and hope. And again, like we can look at Paul the same way we looked at James, like, really, Paul? Like, we're going to glory in tribulations? Like, that's what we're looking for here? But again, it's understanding the context, like what he's talking about. Like Paul just talked about, again, the standing in His grace and the hope in His glory. And the context in which he's saying this, it's not Paul saying, like, you just glory in tribulation. The word, like how this is phrased, it really talks about like holding your head up. Like holding your head up in the situation. But when you read the context of this, it's understanding that it's not saying you, like in your strength, hold your head up in the situation. It's because we stand in His grace, because we hope in His glory, that in the midst of the tribulation, He in His strength will hold our head up. That's what it's talking about here. Like in every part of this, we have to look at like kind of the diminishment of us and the greatness of Him. If we firmly rely on His power, on His greatness, then things become a lot clearer, even in the worst of moments. Like if we think back to Matthew 7, as we've looked at James and we've looked at Romans, we can see that if we follow Jesus, like if we trust in Him, if we actively obey Him, that if I'm built on the right foundation, if I'm built on the rock, that we can weather the storm. But we're not weathering the storm because now I am strong enough to stand up in the storm. We can weather the storm because he in his grace towards us, the joy that we know in him is this storm shelter that can protect us in the midst of the storm. He's what we need in every storm, and they're coming. The wise man in this passage built his house on the rock. All of the storms, they came and they raged and they beat on the house or his life. And what happened? Matthew 7:25, it tells us that his house did not fall because it was founded on the rock. When we look at all of this, we need to understand that it's not look how strong I am, it's look how great he is to carry me through. The same circumstances again happened for the foolish man in 26 and 27. It says, everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rains descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. The same storms came and raged on the foolish man's house. Jesus says that it fell. And Jesus didn't just stop by saying that it fell. He emphasized and says, and great was its fall. Again, it kind of goes back to our thought process last week. Like there's that narrow gate and that wide gate. There's the narrow gate that leads to life. There's the narrow gate or the building on the rock that leads to life. There is the wide gate or the building on the sand that leads to the same thing, destruction, the house falling apart and being destroyed. The only solid foundation for our lives is to be built on active obedience and following Jesus. And that's it. That's the only thing. And as Jesus comes to the end of this sermon, and a great sermon throughout all of these chapters, as Jesus comes to the end of this sermon in verses 28 and 29, it says, and so it was, when Jesus had ended these sayings, that people were astonished at his teaching. For he taught as one having authority and not as the scribes. Jesus finishes teaching, sitting on this mountainside. They're sitting on this mountain. There's people gathered around him. He finishes teaching. It says that these people were astonished by what Jesus was sitting there teaching and telling them about. Not even just what he was saying, but how he was saying it. Because he was speaking with authority. Not just like one of the scribes. He wasn't just rattling off information to people. He was speaking to them in such a way because he is Emmanuel. He is God with us. He was leading them through his teaching and showing them where they need to go because he is like the good shepherd that is leading the sheep. Like they're astonished, but they're seeing God at work. And some of them may not have recognized that yet, but they're seeing something that they couldn't explain. And they've seen all of these religious people talk, and then they saw Jesus, and there was something definitively different. And they were astonished by what they were seeing and what they were hearing. And as we come to the end of his sermon, honestly, that point there at the end, it's kind of like the reason that I felt that God was leading us to start in the book of Matthew. Because the book of Matthew is really the greatest collection of Jesus' own words and teachings. We've talked about before, this guy Matthew that wrote the Gospel of Matthew, he was a tax collector. He was a guy that was keeping numbers and taking notes and doing business. And so he was the one that God used to really record down all the information. When Jesus was talking, Matthew was the one taking notes. And so I wanted to start in the book of Matthew because we want to get these things straight from the source. For us, we want to be grounded specifically on the words and teachings of Jesus. I mean, the whole word, this whole word is God's word, and it's completely applicable, and we need all of it. And we're going to start working through much more of it when we eventually get through Matthew. It's probably still going to be a long time from now. But in Matthew, it's so much of pure Jesus' teaching. And it's like, for us, as we're starting and in the fundamental elements, we need to hear his words. We need to see how he treated people. We need to see how he taught and how he lived and how he discipled the people around him to live like he lived. Like, we need to see it straight from him because we need to follow him specifically. We absolutely need to be built on the right foundation. It's one of the key elements of why we're called Base Church, is it's building on the right foundation or the right base for this church to be built on, and also for our individual lives to be built on. For us, as we read the specific part that Jesus taught today, for us, please know that the storm is coming. It's like it's an analogy statement, but we know hard times are coming. There's a lot of people out there that will teach you that, with Jesus, everything's going to be great. Everything's going to be fine. Like, if you just believe hard enough, that everything's going to be wonderful. But if we teach like that, for one, that's not what Jesus said. But if we teach like that, then when the hard times get here, because they will, then people's faith falls apart because they didn't have their faith in the right thing. They're believing that Jesus leads to this easy life until you meet him. And it's not to say that everything's going to be hard. It's like life with the Lord is wonderful. But as he said last week in the narrow gate, that it will be difficult. He's very clear on that. He's okay saying that. We have to be okay saying that. I want you to understand that because I need to understand that. Because when the hard time gets here, because it will, I want to be firmly grounded and obedient to him, because I know that that is the only place that I will be able to stand through that storm. And that's the same thing for all of us. Again, it's not just acknowledging him. It's not just hearing the words. It's actually doing what he is saying that puts us firmly on that rock. He told us to do that, and we'll stand. He says if you don't, you'll fall, and great will be your fall. Listen to his warning. It's his warning. Listen to it, please. All these people, they stood around listening to him. They're like, man, this guy is talking like I have never heard before. Because he's God. And he has the authority to talk like that. We listen to him today. We read his words. Let's take it with the authority that it deserves because he is God. Listen to what he has to say. That crowds that day were astonished, and we should be astonished too. But please know, too, that for Jesus that day as he was teaching, these people were astonished, but astonishment wasn't the goal. Like, the goal wasn't just astonish people. The goal was disciple making. These people were astonished because of him and his authority, but his goal that day was making disciples that actually listen, do, and follow him through the days of their life. My hope as we hear this passage today that Jesus taught is let's be those disciples. Like, let's ground on the rock. Let's listen to what he has to say. Let's follow him, because let's be astonished in the fact that he is God. We actually have his teaching. It's incredible. Let's follow him. Let's be those disciples. Let's pray.